Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the VORD, inspired by Dr. Last, Anthony Morley, Alex Ebert, Johannes Niederhauser, Alexander Elung, and Alexander VORD. On similarity difference, relations, emergent factors, the Leibniz Oscillation, and staring transhumanist. This paper was inspired by the mentioned individuals, and particularly it's inspired by the theory of total relations and FreQ Theory by Alex Ebert, the work of Cadell Last, Analysis of Situation by Anthony Morley on Leibniz, and the vector theory of Alexander Elung and Alexander VORD, and the conversation between Dr. Niederhauser and Dr. Last called Death and World Grounding. Anything of use and value in this paper is attributed to these individuals. This is simply I think through writing, and this is my attempt to understand their thinking. VORD is an acronym. It means the V stands for vector theory, the O stands for oscillations, the R stands for relations, and the D has a double function of standing for dialectics and death. So when we talk about VORD, we're going to be talking about all those together, and this paper will be an incorporation of all those categories of thoughts into the same umbrella, to the same work. VORD is a play on the word void, where it's the I is removed for an R, which is to suggest that if we move relations in favor of the individual, then we will fall into the void. So we need relations, and relations is sometimes overlooked in favor of individualization, individuality, and singularities, when we really need to take relations more seriously. The general idea of vector theory, and I had a wonderful conversation with Alexander Elung about this, is that there are different ontological vectors that are not reducible to one another, and that's very important because reductionism is contributing to the meaning crisis, is contributing to anti-philosophical thinking, the loss of metaphysics, and so on and so forth. So vector theory is very important, and we can generally think about subphysics, physics, chemistry, biology, mind, and culture as different vectors. And vectors is going to be, I just find it a really important theory, a really useful way to think about the world, because indeed it avoids reductionism, and I'm grateful for VORD and Elung to create this theory. And so we're going to be talking about these vectors. Now, please forgive me, I can't guarantee that in this paper I will necessarily align my terminology perfectly with VORD, Elung, Last, Ebert, so on. I hope that the overall arguments apply, that the structure is useful, the points I make still apply, even if the terminology is not correct all the time. And for that, I ask for your good graces. Again, I hope the paper is useful even if I make mistakes on the details. The question of transhumanism, I think, is very interesting to start this paper, because the transhumanist makes me think of, if we're going to end up, we're heading toward this emergence. I had this talk with Dr. Last on the singularity. We're moving forward to this state where the human seems like they're going to move beyond their humanity, the transhumanism. And the question, there's this funny trans in the word transhumanism that could mean transcend humanity, or it can be a transition of humanity. There could be a problem where if humanity transcends humanity, then it's effaced, it ceases to be itself. But if it's humanity transitioning, this could be a very good thing. So the question is, what is transhumanism? Is it going to be totally other, totally different, or is it going to be an entity to which we can relate? And this is interesting too, because I think, as the paper will attempt, that formally we can compare vectors. The ways that vectors relate can be similar to how humans and perhaps the transhuman will relate. And the question we have to ask, that the paper will explore, is if the transhuman is a being out of Lovecraft, or is it some divine incarnation like a Jesus that we can participate in? And that's going to be an overarching question that this paper, the VORD, will explore. The paper is also going to start in its introduction on discussing Heidegger. And as Dr. Niederhauser recently clarified in Was Heidegger a Technophobe? Heidegger was not anti-technology. He was instead against us being captured by technology thoughtlessly, having it structure our thinking for us. It would seem that Heidegger thought that technology, which turned the world into standing reserves, which turned the world into things for us to use instead of observe, was the logical end of Western metaphysics. metaphysics. And so there was a sense in which, by the very way that the West thought, it had to end up with technology that turned the world into a standing reserve, and that was reductionist, because that was just the logic of Western metaphysics. And so we can view Heidegger's project as a way to correct that Western metaphysics, so we don't turn the world into a bunch of standing reserves, and instead let the world and its being actually meet us, and we encounter it without trying to have dominion over it in a way that turns the world into things that serve us as opposed to we observe it. So Heidegger's not necessarily a technophobe, or he hates technology, but he is concerned, following Dr. Niederhauser, with the ways that technology thoughtlessly structures our orientation and towardness to the world. And there's a sense in which if we just let technology do our thinking for us, then we end up reduced, and we end up in reductionism. We reduce the world simply to its technological use. And this tendency of reductionism that you see in technology, or technology can engender, could be similar to the tendency of thinking about the world as just being atoms, or just being made of material, or biology just being chemistry. There's a similar reductionist move that is occurring there that we need to learn to resist. Now, we should note that we don't say overcome technology for Heidegger by avoiding it, in the same way that we don't learn courage by avoiding what scares us. We have to rise to the occasion of technology. We have to meet it. But that also means we have to face the possible terror of technology arising to a transhumanism that is more of a, say, Neon Genesis third impact than a beatific vision, something that results in the ultimate effacement of human individuality into this collective nothingness, as opposed to a beatific vision, which is a harmony of all beings into a state of unity that is at the same time not reductionist. It's a harmony, not a wholeness. There's still difference, but it's a difference like a symphony orchestra that comes together. So facing the problem of technology is what we must do, but how exactly are we to do that, and how are we to do that well? Well, as I talked with Dr. Last on singularity, first, learning to be comfortable with difference, learning to be comfortable with individualization, gaps, lacks, that seems to be a major component. And for me, therefore, vector theory has a way of training us to think in a manner that might make us able to use or approach transhumanism, and then the technological singularity that I think aligns with the question of transhumanism, to view these things not as a indirect way for us not to fall into the temptation of trying to return to the womb through these things, but instead to approach them not expecting them to remove lack or gap, to understand that our difference, of which necessarily creates lack and gap, is a necessary component to our being and our ontology. So we need to approach transhumanism in a manner that is not escapist. If we do approach it searching for escapism, it is likely that we are going to end up effaced by transhumanism, as opposed to negated and correspondingly sublimated, which would be Hegelian terms. So if we want transhumanism to be something that benefits us, then we need to have a way of thinking that as we approach it, we don't search for a way to avoid lack or to avoid death, which Mr. Ebert will talk about as causing cancer when we try to avoid death as opposed to integrate with death. All of these ways of thought are going to have an impact on the way that we experience and undergo transhumanism, the singularity, and so on and so forth. And vector theory could, say, help train us and habituate us to thinking in a manner that increases the likelihood that transhumanism will not be a Lovecraft experience, but instead might be more akin to a Dante beatific vision. So these things can overlap in different ways. To start, section 1 is going to talk about this strange situation where something is totally new only if it has nothing to do with what came before it. But that would suggest that something totally new is something that we basically can't even recognize as new, because it so little relates to what came before it that it's hard to see any pattern. It's hard to say that it is new as opposed to just entirely other. So there's this very interesting dilemma where something totally new can't even be related to even recognize it as totally new. Similarly, when we talk about the word sameness, there really is no such thing as sameness. Two cups that are identical in every way occupy different locations in space-time and geometrical space, so they're not the same. Two things that are the same are not two, they're one. So there's this strange thing that whenever we talk about sameness, we're really just talking about similarity. And in fact, sameness, true sameness, would be an effacement. It would be the loss of the two for one. But the reason something is similar instead of the same is because it's not totally similar. There is difference. So that would suggest wherever there's similarity, there's actually difference. Whenever we talk about similarity, we're simultaneously talking about difference. And that would also suggest that all relation is a relation between things that entail a mixture of similarity and difference. Because again, if two things are the same, they are not two. They are exactly, they are the same entity. This is also interesting to consider, because then what does it mean when we talk about wholes? Like if we say this bookcase over here, well, the bookcase is composed of a lot of parts, right? And those parts never come together to be the same thing. They're always relating into an emergent whole that is the bookcase, but we can never say that the parts become part of the quote-unquote same thing. For me, it can be helpful to think about concerts instead of wholes, like a symphony orchestra. A concert would be, say, you have violins and cellos and pianos, and none of the instruments are exactly the same. There could be sections of similar instruments, but the string sections, and maybe there's 5 violins in the string sections playing the same thing. But the concert as a whole is composed of a lot of difference, and yet the concert comes together to make an emergent phenomenon of Beethoven's Ninth. So it would be impossible to come up with Beethoven's Ninth unless you had all of that difference operating together in a harmony. So in a sense, we can think about a bookcase. Instead of asking what are the parts that make up the bookcase, we can start thinking of the bookcase as a concert, an emergent result of all the parts playing together per se to give rise to that whole. Because again, we can't think about parts as part of the quote-unquote same thing, because there is no sameness. There's only similarity. And when a bunch of different instruments are playing Beethoven's Ninth, they share similarity. There's similarity between those instruments. So for me, it can be useful, instead of talking about parts and wholes, it could be useful to talk about parts and concerts. And I will note that concerts have parts, right? You know, the strings will play one part, the flutes will play another part, so on and so on. So it's interesting to think about parts and wholes. I think also today we see a movement toward difference, an emphasis on difference, the uniqueness of the individual, essential difference. It's very Deleuzian. We live in a very Deleuzian age, and I think there's a lot of good to Deleuze. I think his ontology is rather beautiful. My critiques of Deleuze are in regard to his epistemology, where he disowns Hegel. Now, arguably, he disowned Hegel and proceeds to himself be a Hegelian, but that would be another conversation, and I try to discuss that in the essential difference of Deleuze versus the dialectical similarity of Hegel. But the notion I want to stress is that I think Deleuze, we can think of his ontology as being about essential difference, or this kind of pure difference. But in the same way that there's no such thing as sameness, there's also no pure difference. Something that is totally different would lose the capacity to relate to other things, to recognize itself as difference. And so when something becomes purely different, it's an effacement, just like sameness. A pure difference is a kind of sameness, because then the thing that is purely different, whatever is purely different, it becomes all there is to itself, and thus all there is sameness unto that entity, because it loses the capacity to relate to what is outside of it. So in the reaction against sameness, in the reaction against conformity, we can make a mistake of going too far in the direction of difference and end up in a pure difference that is practically identical to sameness as a kind of effacement. And that's a mistake we have to be careful of. So ultimately, that means we're going to end up in the realm of similarity. But if we're in the realm of similarity, that means we're also in the realm of difference, because similarity, in order to not be sameness, must entail some degree of difference. Considering all this, there's a strange sense in which the equal sign, like you see in mathematics, never actually applies to the real world. The equal sign is always an abstraction. If two things equal one another, there's not two things equaling one another. They're identical. This is also suggesting that A is problematic, that Aristotle talks about. Now, I'm not saying that the equal sign, when used in logic or mathematics, is not valid. I'm not saying that math is not valid, or logic, or these different things, or that even A is A doesn't have use in certain contexts. But the strange truth is that the very use of an equal sign would suggest that we are dealing with a map and not the territory, because again, two things can't equal one another without ceasing to be two things. No two things are identical. So the equal sign is always suggesting, the only things that can equal are things that are self-relating to themselves. And if they're self-relating to themselves, it's not clear in what meaningful sense we could say they equal one another. They just are one another. The equal sign would not have a clear meaning. So now I think perhaps, as we'll get into later, we can use the equal sign. If the equal sign is used meaningfully, then it would actually be the separation of a vector from another vector. It would be in instances of transcendental emergence, as Mr. Bard would suggest, where chemistry equals chemistry. And you could say that when that strange moment arises in the midst of quote-unquote physics, the vector of physics, where chemistry emerges, well, then the equal sign appears. But the moment it does, it breaks the vector of which the new equal sign emerges relative to, then breaks from the previous vector. Even if that previous vector caused it somehow, it is no longer reducible to that vector. So there is a sense, perhaps, where we could talk about the appearance, the emergence of an equal sign occurring when there's the emergence of a new transcendental vector. But outside of that, very, very, very rare and unique context, the equal sign is a pure abstraction. Now, again, this would also mean that math is created as opposed to realized, and that it is indeed an abstraction whenever we're talking about equivalence or math that is leading to some sort of equaling, some sort of parallelism. Now, that doesn't mean math isn't extremely useful, but I mean, goodness, we're tempted to think that it's realized instead of created precisely because it is so useful and so good at accurately representing the world. But the existence of the equal sign is problematic. And strangely enough, I meant to note this. We were talking about how pure difference is practically the same as sameness. But whereas we have a word for extreme similarity like sameness, we don't have a word for extreme difference. That would be the equivalent of sameness on the side of difference. So we have to use this phrase, pure difference. But it's interesting that there's no word that means pure difference in the same way that sameness means pure similarity. I find that very interesting. But curiously, pure difference actually is itself an equal sign because it can't relate to anything and therefore can only relate to itself. So it equals itself and only itself. So there's a strange sense that the pure difference is practically an equal sign in the same way that sameness is a quote unquote equal sign. But that all said, there are distinctions of emphasis that could be brought out, and it should simply be noted that there's no symbol for pure difference as there is a symbol for sameness that is the equal sign. That's curious to me. You could say the unequal sign is the symbol of pure difference, but not really, because you could the unequal sign would apply to two cats that are completely identical but not in the same geometric space. Therefore, the unequal sign would apply. So the unequal sign is simply not precise enough to be uniquely designated to pure difference. Now, what's curious too is if all entities can't be pure difference or just sameness, and the only equivalence that ever applies is those things to themselves, which is kind of meaningless, then that would mean everything is a mixture of similarity and difference, and that similarity and difference is dialectically relating to one another and shaping one another. So there's a sense in which every single entity is a processing, which we could also refer to as a becoming. So there's a sense in which a being is a processing, where it is processing. It is a process of its similarity and difference. But it's also a processing in that it is the coming to be of that dialectical process of similarity and difference. So I like the word processing because because entities are a process and they are undergoing their own becoming as processes. So I think the word processing is quite useful. And of course, the question, to point back to what we were saying, what is the event that awaits us, the transhumanist event, that the mind is processing toward and will arise to? Will that event be something out of Lovecraft, or will it be some sort of homeostatic union, if I can recall, hypostatic union between the divine and the human, say in a Jesus, an incarnation? So that's a question. And also, once that capital E event occurs, or the transhumanist event, will it be something that we can relate to enough to process, therefore make sense of, or will it be so totally new and totally different that we won't be able to process it? And in us being processes, if we can't process it, it could overwhelm us and it could be our effacement. But if we could process it, then that might mean it could be a space of negation of ourselves for sublation into that new transhumanist event, or what may await us up ahead. Now, moving on, if we take seriously this idea that the equal sign never really applies to things in the world because no two things are actually the same, then we have to start understanding that lack, gap, are going to be essential, that they're going to be part of the world in ways that cannot ultimately be overcome. If every gap and every lack could be overcome or filled or wholeness achieved, then the equal sign could accurately apply to reality, but it cannot. And Elung and Bard are going to stress how in vector theory there are these kind of essential differences between vectors, where vectors can't equal one another, that they mark out boundaries of their own equivalence. Yes, chemistry, things that all fall in the vector of chemistry, in fact, are equal to one another in the sense that they are part of the vector of chemistry. But that's a very general sense of equivalence. We can't really go much beyond that. And within that equivalence, there is still endless difference in the manifestation of different chemicals that entail a similarity difference. So equivalence can only be used in a very, very general sense of marking off the boundaries of a vector. Regarding the vector of chemistry, hydrogen is different from lithium, but hydrogen and lithium are similar in that they are both defined within chemistry. So yes, there's a sense in which we can say there's a kind of equivalence between everything that falls within the same vector, but that equivalence is limited to that vector. And this is very important because we can't say that vectors equal one another. There is a essential irreducibility to each. Which again is a reason also why I think vector theory is so great. Now that doesn't mean that vectors cannot somehow arise to one another, that you can't have physics emerge out of subphysics, chemistry emerge out of physics. But once the transcendental emergence occurs, there is now an essential gap between the vectors. That cannot be done away with. If we use that language of processing, again, we can say that within each vector is a process, but there are no processes between vectors. Now, if we use that language of process again, and we talked about how similarity and difference is a process, everything is in a process of similarity, difference in its being, then we can say that within each vector there is a process, but there are no processes between vectors. So culture, the vector of culture or mind, they consist of processes within those vectors that you can say, are mind, or the process of hydrogen within the vector of chemistry. But you cannot say there's a process between physics and chemistry. Even if chemistry emerged out of physics, there's no process between them because they are irreducible. Now, this is going to suggest some very interesting questions that we have to answer. Because if processes and processing occurs within vectors but not between them, then how is understanding possible between vectors, which is going to be intellectual processing? Another question, how is transition possible between vectors, which is going to be ontological processing? And then a third question for much later in the paper on how is interaction possible between vectors. So in order for us to suggest that there's irreducibility between vectors, then we have to suggest there's no processes between vectors. There are only processing in vectors. But that, of course, begs those three questions, which, we don't want to have some sort of Descartesian Cartesianism between vectors, where it's this strange dualism where you have mind and body, but they don't, they're kind of separate of one another in strange ways, kind of ghost ways that don't really make sense. Well, we want to make sure we avoid that with vector theory. So how exactly do we do that? And again, I want to stress that if we think of everything as becoming, then I like the language of processing, because that means everything is in a process of being itself and also concluding what it means to be itself. It's processing, like a computer is processing. So processing, I think, is a nice language. So we can also, we talked about like mental vector, biological vector. I think you can also almost use the language of cultural processing, mental processing, biological processing, chemical processing, where each vector sort of marks out where one processing begins and another ends without any of them being reducible to one another. So all of these are these different vectors of becoming, these different vectors of processing. And I like processing too, because as Mr. Bard stresses, I like that word because he says there's no meta law and we don't know the outcome of it ahead of time, where processing kind of has that double notion of figuring out what it is in the middle of it. Whereas, you can have that with becoming as well, but the problem with the word becoming, I think, can be that it suggests that there's a preset things that things are becoming, that they're heading toward. Like we think of a caterpillar as becoming a butterfly. So things are becoming. But it's kind of a sense that there's a pre-existing thing where when we use the language of processing, it's kind of like, figuring out, like when a computer is processing or a calculator is processing a formula, we don't necessarily know the outcome ahead of time. So I think the word processing can be kind of nice there, and to think of each vector as its own unique, vector of processing that cannot be reduced to one another. But of course, that leaves us with those questions we discussed. Now we'll start off here trying to describe this intellectual processing, how that could be possible between vectors if they are irreducible to one another. After that, we'll deal with this question of ontological processing, which will get us into the very process of transcendental emergentism and how that might occur. And then the third question will be on the nature of vector interaction. We have to recognize that, first off, all fields kind of naturally entail a bracketing out of all the other ones. So, for example, if you're a physicist, you generally, as you study physics, you act as if there is no chemistry and biology, mind and culture. You kind of bracket those out. Not because you believe they don't matter, it's just your focus. It's just the nature of focus. Similarly, if you're a chemist, you kind of study chemistry as if independent from mind and biology and so on and so forth. Now, what's curious is if you're a biologist, you likely have to know chemistry and physics and subphysics as well. But if you're a physicist, you don't necessarily have to know chemistry, biology, and mind and culture. It would seem to be that higher up the vector tower that one wants to specialize and focus in, the more the more vectors they're going to have to take into account, because even if biology cannot be reduced to chemistry, precisely because the vector emerged out of chemistry, it has some image and likeness, some similarity, some compositional features with chemistry that have to be taken into account, even if it ultimately cannot be reduced to chemistry. Certainly, biological entities are composed of chemicals, but that doesn't mean they're just chemicals, but that would mean that there are probably chemical principles, laws, whatever, from chemistry that you have to learn in order to learn biology. So it's interesting to note that higher up the vector tower you're dealing with, the more you might have to take into account lower vectors on the tower. And by lower, I don't mean a hierarchy at all. It's just a description of the tower. Also, we have to understand the moment we're talking about understanding, so the possibility of understanding between vectors, we are talking about an act of mind. So it's an act that is possible because of the vector of mind. Biology does not seek to understand chemistry. Maybe biology interacts with chemistry, as we'll talk about later, but understanding is inherently mind. So we're talking about humans, basically us, as far as we know, unless there are aliens. But the question of how we understand is going to be the question of how mind understands. And basically, it has a lot to do with imagination, memory. I have the ability to imagine. I can leave my immediate frame. I can imagine the universe to itself. I can put myself in the place of the vector of physics and think within that vector of physics. Now, I can't do it perfectly, but imagination makes it possible for me to, say, jump down from mind into physics and to think according to physics, and maybe from physics work up back to mind. But and maybe from physics work back up to mind, but imagination is what makes this possible. Now, what's curious as well is if I really want to understand the vector of, say, biology, I need to make the start of my inquiry in biology, and then from biology actually jump down to, say, subphysics and work up so that I can get a full understanding of the processes that emerge to biology and what biology is, because it's going to have quote-unquote image and likeness relative to the vectors below it. But I need to make my starting point biology, which of course I can never do perfectly because I am in fact a mind. I can never enter biology perfectly. But I need to at least try to make my starting point biology. Also, though, since mind emerged out of biology, I might have a better shot at making my starting point biology than, say, if I were to make it culture. Culture is the vector over mind, or at least following this vector tower. And again, my entire representation of the vector tower could be ultimately incorrect, but hopefully the ideas that are being described are accurate. But what we'll say is that regarding the vector tower, vectors that are below a given vector embody it. So mind embodies biology, chemistry, physics, and subphysics, while mind participates in culture. So I can understand culture to some degree because I participate in culture, but I can never really fully get culture since it is emergent over the individual, and that's where you get into collective thinking, the invisible hand, all these different notions. Mind participates in culture, so it can get some level of understanding of culture, but not fully. Whereas since mind embodies biology, chemistry, physics, and subphysics, there might be a higher chance that mind can understand those vectors because it embodies those vectors. Now, just the paper will make this distinction between theoretic and practically. It may be practically impossible for me to learn everything about physics, just simply because I have a lifespan and I can't occupy all space and time and so on and so forth. But even if it's practically impossible for me to learn all physics or chemistry or biology, it may be theoretically possible for me to do so because I embody those vectors as a mind. Whereas when it comes to the vector of culture, it is both practically and theoretically impossible for me to fully grasp it. Because culture is a vector I participate in, and therefore is more complex than mind. So the vectors a given vector embodies are perhaps practically unknowable in their fullness, but not theoretically. Whereas the vectors a vector participates in are practically and theoretically totally unknowable, even if we can know certain things to certain degrees. But this part of the paper is going to describe how one would go about understanding different vectors. And carry out the possibility of understanding, even though vectors are irreducible to one another. Again, if we're going to understand biology, we can use imagination. We make that the starting point of our inquiry, and the other thing the paper is going to say is when we say if we want to understand chemistry, we can't go like deconstruct mind down into biology, down into chemistry, because that's reductionist. You're treating each vector in your inquiry as if they can be reduced to the other. Instead, what one does is if one wants to examine physics, you have to quote unquote jump down straight to physics through imagination, not through like descending a staircase, because that would be reductionist. But instead, you jump right down into physics and start your inquiry there. So there are different moves that have to be made in order to make possible intellectual processing that does not unintentionally reduce vectors. So thanks to participation and embodiment, if we're thinking of the whole vector tower, it is possible for mind to achieve understanding, intellectual processing between vectors. And this is because the mind makes possible imagination and memory. And memory plays a role here too. This addresses question 1 that we brought up before, but we still have to answer question 2, which is how transition would be possible between vectors, which would be ontological processing. That is the question to which we will now turn, but it is also the case that we will have to eventually address question 3, which is the question of interaction between vectors. Looking ahead, if the transhuman is totally new, it will participate in an entirely new different vector. All true difference is new. And that means it will embody us while we only participate in it. Since there is participation, there is reason to think that the transhuman will not necessarily efface us, but if our participation is radically limited, then the transhuman could still practically prove totally different and hence cause effacement. Are we confident in our ability to manage the emergence of the transhuman to assure that negation sublation occurs versus effacement? On what grounds? And to answer that question, we will have to continue in our journey. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you so much for your time.